Greetings, friends. I was thinking of calling this modern urban pessimism, or just a collection of thoughts on modern urban living. I don't necessarily mean this to be pessimistic or cynical. I'm just trying to reflect and understand the situation we find ourselves in the contemporary cities, in the contemporary suburbs. Many of us, most of us in the West, live in urban areas. I don't really listen to the Arcade Fire anymore, but in 2012, The Suburbs, and it was a good album, good lyrics. So I wanted to read just one section of their song, The Suburbs. And all of the walls that they built in the 70s finally fall. And all of the houses they built in the 70s finally fall. Meant nothing at all. Meant nothing at all. It meant nothing. I mean, I think the meaning is pretty clear there. What meant nothing at all? I mean, obviously a house is just a place to live. It's not like houses in the past were necessarily more meaningful. They may have been. I mean, what is a thatch house in the year 900 in some Frankish village? It's like thatch and mud and whatever. It's going to fall down pretty soon. I mean, no, it's your community, obviously. It's your community that had never had any meaning. And if you're flipping houses, and we all do, well, not all of us, but that's something we have good reason to do. But it does illustrate that there's not really much connection to the community here. I mean, we're all trying to make a buck. We're trying to take care of our families. Okay, my family. I don't have. I mean, you might know people on your street. Of course, that's nice. Of course, I knew some people on my street when I grew up in the suburbs. I didn't know most of them, though, and I don't think that's uncommon. Are you going to know everyone on your street? Are you going to mean? And then the Arcade Fire on the same album, their song Sprawl 2. Can we ever get away from the sprawl? Living in the sprawl. Dead shopping malls rise like mountains beyond mountains, and there's no end in sight. I need the darkness. Someone, please cut the lights. So we see this endless nature, this sprawl. That's a way of referring to the suburbs, because to sprawl is an act. It's like to unfold, to unwrap, to cover a wide area in plainness, in something of a uniform function. And therefore, to reduce the meaning, to wipe away meaning, both man-made meaning and also the organized chaos of nature. It wipes away both and replaces it with this false version of the English countryside, fake version of the English countryside, which is the suburbs, which is sprawl, without practically no countryside left, because it all just the houses get closer and closer together, and then you have less space. You don't even have any space anymore. Even if it's empty concrete space, you don't even have that anymore. And then I like the line at the end, I need the darkness, someone please cut the lights. That was a bit, like what's the meaning there? But yet that line struck me the most, because that was kind of the best, that was the whole point. That was the whole climax of what they're getting at there. I need the darkness because everything is lit up in functionalism. Everything has a sign, like Baudrillard would say. Everything is participating in, this is for that, that's the sidewalks for that, there's my garage, there's my car, material, and literal lights. Like imagine the light, the intense light of a mall parking lot at midnight. Intense, and this is not a light to hang out under because it's too bright, it's too intense. Everything is burned in this plastic light. So I need the darkness, the same way I like the River Valleys by James Gardens, by Lambton Woods, where there are deer passing through at night, where it is dark. You are away from the city lights. It's safe. You don't have to worry about getting mugged. It's dark. It's quiet. That's why we need the darkness. That's why people are thirsty for the dimness of the balance between our order and beauty and between the organized chaos of nature. All participating in a religious system, from Matthew Goodband in their album Beautiful Midnight, the song Suburbia. And listening to this song when I was 13 years old, 14, 15, 16, around that age, I knew right away what he was talking about. No doubt, everything was crystal clear. And in that song, he says, "There ain't nothing here at all. Another day, a week, the mall. Someday, this place is gonna burn. Is your whole life in there, waiting? Someday, your head is going to turn, and you'll realize, I'm missing. Do you realize?" Who's missing? Someone's missing. Again, people are going to see this. I'm happy. What do you don't tell me something's missing in my life. Don't tell me. And again, I get it. I'm not necessarily telling you there's something missing in your life because of where you live. Okay, I'm not trying to be that simplistic here, but we know there is something missing in the overall situation, the planning, the lack of community. So when he says you're missing, after growing up in the suburbs, suburbs aren't just a thing in big cities, by the way. Anything, towns outside the city, it's all the same plan. It's all the same neighborhood layout. Look at Ontario, look at southern Ontario. It's not just Toronto, it's like any town in Toronto. They will all pretty much look very similar. There are places that will look different, but generally speaking, same. It's like, what street is this? This could be just a generic street anywhere. So who's missing? Obviously for me, you could always tell that the suburbs there was something empty and something missing there. But looking back on it now, and I'm not just, you could say, well, this is just your life. It's not necessarily the place you live in. But what's missing in our culture is lack of community, lack of God. Although I did say we always have religion, but I would say that the Christian God, and lack of purpose, lack of beauty, lack of substance. That's important. There's nothing hard. There's nothing. What do we get in these lyrics that we've looked at? All of these houses they've built in the 70s, just a few decades ago, they fall. And there was never anything there. There was never any real meaning there. There was never any real community there. I grew up in an old suburb called Etobicoke, which is now part of Toronto. And that is now being encroached upon with large condo towers, lots of development, lots of change. This is going on, big developments, new commercial strips, but mostly condos, mostly the housing boom that's gone on. So we've gone from a situation where most people would have owned houses from the 50s up until the 80s, or the 90s, and then the millennial generation, of course, much less of us are in a position to own houses or separate houses. But I just have a collection of thoughts here. They're all sort of part of the theme, but they don't necessarily all, necessarily go together. But like I could observe in my neighborhood here, which is not a suburb, I live closer to the city, not all the way downtown, because I've lived downtown before, and about four different locations, close to the University of Toronto campus, close to Yonge Street, which is also one of the the main streets in Toronto, and so I've had my take of that, and that has its own problems. The suburbs have their problems. The suburbs are, of course, nicer. More people would want to live in the suburbs if they could afford it, but suburbs have their own problem. Downtown, that's just going to be more buzzing, more that constant, intense energy. Some people like that. I don't like that because it's not peaceful, it's not chill. So I'm living in this neighborhood because it's affordable. I will hopefully within a few years be out of here. And but you can notice on my street here, it's a fairly busy road, and some people will be hanging out on their front porch. And this is very rare. You wouldn't see. I mean, some people maybe on the side streets you might see some people sitting on their front steps, but for people to be relaxing on a very busy street, a street where there could be trucks and delivery vans and ambulances, police cars, just everything. I mean, it's only about 4 lanes, like 2 lanes each way. But for this location in Toronto, it's going to be a heavy artery. And that doesn't faze these people. I think, it's black people. It's not the black people I've talked about before that were playing the loud music. These are other black people down the street. And I think it's cool because that shows that they're chill. That shows that they don't, the traffic doesn't bother them, and they're hanging out with their friends and family just on the porch there. But so I can respect that, but for me, it would be that's not chill. I wouldn't want to do that. I think many other people wouldn't want to do that. And you can see that some cultures, some races, they are accustomed to this sort of urban noise in different levels. And I'm not trying to say one is better than the other. It's just interesting to see how different people react to that. And I'm not saying that all black people are willing, like chilling out on a busy street like that. But in general, black people are more chill. They're more relaxed people than white people. So white people, we like. That's why white people created the whole idea of like parks and at least the kind of parks that you would find in North America. I mean the city park, the ravines, the bike paths, all of that stuff. I mean, Canada was originally mostly white, so these are all creations of that time. And you don't see many of the minorities using the bike paths in Toronto, which is interesting because there's lots of their projects and lots of their apartment towers are right on these bike paths, especially if you go up the Humber, which goes through, adjacent to it, or goes through Etobicoke, adjacent to York, North York. It continues, and then so there's plenty of big towers. Somalians, they congregate in local parks, but they don't really. You wouldn't see them on bikes like traversing the whole path. You wouldn't see those people further up on the path. I mean, of course, there are some avid sports cyclists who are black, who are Asians. Of course, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying of those specifically immigrant communities, they're not into the whole idea of recreational enjoyment of nature. That's mostly an old stock Canadian thing, or a so-called Western or North American thing. I don't know how it is in Europe. I know Germans have lots of forests and they probably like their forests. And England, it must be different because they don't have as much. The land is much more, it's been utilized, it's been cultivated, it's been partitioned off. So they might not have that same idea of nature, but they have their own nature. It's like the English countryside. It sounds very nice to me. And that's the thing. It's like, we don't want the chaos, the full chaos of nature. We don't want the full orderliness of a man-made world. We want a balance, which ideally is the Garden of Eden, or at least that's an archetype. A nice balance. So you could see that in the English countryside. You maybe see that in flying over Switzerland or passing through Switzerland or southern Germany in a train, and you see how they would set aside forest land, but very neatly and very orderly. So you have your patches of forest and then lots of open agricultural land, very productive. Could look boring if you haven't been here before, but maybe once you get to know that area, you could appreciate the true value of it, about how it's been so productive for the people, about all the history that goes into it, and every nook and cranny has its own story. We don't quite have that in North America. It's more the functional metropolitan area, and then the expansive space of forest, rocks, marshes, mostly unproductive land, because if it was productive, it would have been put to agricultural use a long time ago. Canada is the second largest country in the world, but it's never going to have that many people because most of the land is filled with marshes and lakes. It's like you hear of other parts of the world where there's not enough water. Well, we have too much water. There's never a thing as having too much fresh water, but we have all these lakes and everything. So that, unless you could drain all these lakes, that land can never be put to agricultural use. And so it's always going to be like that. Most of Manitoba is going to be unpopulated. Most of Saskatchewan, most of Northern Ontario is. You can have a cottage up there, but what are you going to make economic use of the land? What, maybe mining or something like that. So, but anyways, we want this rooting to the land. We want a balance between our own ordered world and nature. But the thing is, it's not enough to just live in the suburbs and you have your nice ordered world and you have lots of nice parks, lots of trees. That's nice. And we all, I mean, different cultures like trees more than others. But the thing is, you also have to have some concept of God. I mean, people would disagree with me, but you know, truth or beauty, something good, something which is perhaps you would say like an organized form of chaos. That's sort of like the balance between nature and the man-made world. Like having a lot of trees. Trees are they grow how they grow. You can prune them, but it's like a form of organized chaos. Like if you look at the suburbs, there's a reason that many people could tell that the suburbs were spiritually empty places. They're a product mostly of the 20th century. I mean, I know you can say a suburb is any sort of exurban, suburban, you know, outside the dense core, and then that's gone back throughout history. There's always been expansions beyond the city walls. So, but in the sense of it was basically, you know, to some extent a pre-war or interwar period creation, but it really got going after the World War II, especially in the 50s, especially with the government helping families finance their new homes or making it easy for them to get mortgages on homes and encouraging a lifestyle. And much of this is a good thing. Much of it was a good thing for encouraging population growth. And of course, it led to the baby boom, lots of kids. But then the baby boom grew up largely in a suburban world, which was very spiritually empty. And I'll try to explain why. Empty, you could look at it in terms of, well, just the architecture, very tacky, very plain. I mean, of course, I'm generalizing a bit here. But I'm not necessarily saying the suburbs are so bad. I'm just saying there is some emptiness there. In a place like Etobicoke, where I grew up, I mean, we have so many trees. That's one of its saving graces, is all the trees. We have a canopy a lot of the time. There's the idea that is not popular with Italians and Portuguese, that you want to have some privacy, some shade, some coverage, so people from the street can see your house, but you know there might be a tree in front of it, and you're ideally, you know, some distance removed from the street, and so you're not right up there by traffic. Or if you are closer to the street, then it's a quiet, relatively quiet street, not like a through street. And these were all planned out specifically. It's very planned. There's a functionalism that is boring, which is spiritually empty, because everything is set aside for some functional use, which sounds nice, right? It's like, oh, everything should have a use. But then if everything has a use, then there's no, and it's hard to say. There has to be some sort of a little bit of, I don't want to say mystery, but some extra breathing space for something slightly outside the clear sign. And I don't mean to get into Jean Baudrillard. I mean, his philosophy could be used to interpret this, but he's also like spends a lot of time writing and saying things that are unnecessary. Like he's just a very wordy writer that uses a lot of vague terminology that. But you can't take him too seriously, because he's very pessimistic about society, and I may be coming across as pessimistic here. But you know, I was interested in Baudrillard when I was interpreting the suburbs, when I was studying anthropology and geography, and I was very interested in the suburbs, having grown up there, and so I used Baudrillard, even though he's an anthropologist, from a geographical lens. And I mean, Baudrillard described Los Angeles as like a desert of meaning, and I mean, you can understand things about what Baudrillard is trying to interpret the modern condition, and he does have a lot of good points. I mean, by the way, I mean his writings inspired the movie The Matrix, so he was an influential guy. But like I said, he goes on writing, and you read all these paragraphs, and it's like, don't think that there's any hidden meaning in there. A lot of it's just wordy crap. But he did have some points, like the desert of meaning. When everything becomes a sign, like the gas station, the sidewalk here and here, Can you ever imagine yourself chilling somewhere? I mean, not all that many people are chill these days. Perhaps we've gone through a psychological change where people are less chill. And it's no, I mean, chill means being composed. It doesn't just mean being relaxed. I use this word because it's a word I grew up with. It's the best way I can use to convey this feeling. But composed, relaxed, but also, I mean, having some sense of humor, having some ability to enjoy yourself in the moment, appreciate a place for what it is. That can go for having a conversation, interaction with someone, like listening to them, making eye contact, reading body language. Generally, chill people are good at these things. They're not quite opposite safe people. Generally, you could say safe people are the opposite of that. Maybe not perfect opposite, but they're less able to read signs. And when it comes to a space, geographically, the tendency, the inclination to just hang out. Would you hang out on a sidewalk? I mean, maybe kids would do that. I don't know. You've set aside a small grassy median. It's now cut off. I mean, there's energetic flows here. There's psychological signals. There's the whole feel of it's like, no, you're close to the cars. You're a certain distance from your house. You're probably not going to hang out right there. Just having a grassy space, just having a little parquet is not going to make people automatically want to hang out there, especially if there's some big wall, some big building right next to it. It doesn't have a lot of natural light. Are you going to want to lay down in the sun there? Haha, see, laying down in the sun is something a chill person would do. Would you do that in an urban environment? I mean, people do that in Trinity Bellwoods Park in Toronto. But then the problem with that is that's hive mind mentality, because that's so close to the core of the city that Trinity Bellwoods, people are laying down on dirty grass. It's mostly dirt. They're hipsters. They're millennials. They have their funny clothes and their bicycles and all. I mean, I like my bike too. But, they have their certain culture and their certain appearance, but they're too close to each other. They're only 15 feet away from each other. Just so many people in this park. It's a different mentality. That's for some white people. That's not for me, because I'm from Etobicoke. Etobicoke is chill because we have just as many trees as any other region of the city. Probably the most trees. Probably the most treed part of the city. I mean, North York is going to have a lot. But if you go out, obviously, the downtown, they don't have as many trees. Toronto has a lot of trees in general. But if you go to the East End, far less trees. That's when you get into the real ugliness of the suburbs. Then you really see how ugly it really was, because all these trees was like a Band-Aid solution to make things appear beautiful. Because houses can look nice, but houses are still they're not going to be there in 30, 40 years. They're going to be torn down. So that community was never too meaningful for you, because you moved on, you flipped your house, you made money. Nothing wrong with that. We all do that. There was never anything too meaningful there. And the trees were there to make the neighborhood nicer, to give it a freshness, to absorb heat from the sun, and just give it that organized chaos, because it's not too much chaos, it's organized. You prune the trees. They provide some nice shelter and some beauty and some more connection to the earth, because we're trying to reestablish that connection to the earth. But once the trees go, then you see the nakedness of the concrete. And like I was saying, Italians, Portuguese, they like to display their houses. It's a bit different. Asians, I don't know if they're big on the trees either. It's hard to say. I mean, a lot of these ethnic groups populated older suburbs that were built in like the early 20th or the late 19th century, like so-called working class homes, which are much more densely packed. My neighborhood is similar to that. Not quite, but yeah, definitely much more densely packed houses where you won't have much of a backyard. In fact, the front door may be steps from the street. You won't really even have a front yard in many cases. And of course, these are filled with successive generations. So it's not like, I don't know if they would have chosen to build houses like that anyways. This is what happens later in the stage of this city. And I'm sure you could see this process play itself out in other North American cities too, in a different, somewhat different fashion. Well, where do you start this process? I mean, you could start it anywhere, but one convenient place of starting it would be the enclosure movement, which began in Europe, but specifically in Britain. It's hard to say when it began, but it was sort of like in the 17th century and the 18th centuries when it really took off and really made its biggest impact. So what was enclosure? Enclosure was simply enclosing the land with boundaries. And before enclosure, it was more of the medieval pattern where there would be the lord and then his tenants. And there would be some land fenced off for specific use of the lord, the church would have its land. The church had a lot of land. The church was much more influential in the past, before the Reformation. Even after the Reformation, not that much longer after, things started to change, of course. Things became more materialistic. I'm not saying that the culture that came later was worse or better, but there were some positives and negatives. And one thing that happened was you did get this more rise in at least materialism in terms of looking at your actual physical space and now money is king. Money in terms of selling wool. The aristocrats wanted to raise more wool in Britain, and then they could sell it on the continent and make a lot of money. So therefore, they had tenants that were using the land, and now the tenants were less valuable to them than raising wool, raising these sheep to sell their wool for money. Right, for gold and silver. And so they would have rents. This is when it became more important that you got to keep paying your rent. And it wasn't like everyone got kicked off their land, but generally enclosure meant that many, many people, in fact, a huge segment of society, became impoverished and became landless laborers, which gave rise to later the factory workers of the 19th century, and which fed into our current modern industrial society, with many people who own no property, who are you could call them wage slaves, or just people who are itinerant, or people who are moving about. Many of us are moving about. In fact, it's affected many of us, not just that segment, not just a supposed underclass. We've all become moving about and more rootless. I'm not saying that these people weren't impoverished before enclosure. Certainly there were famines, there were military requirements for service for the peasants and the serfs, and life was just as difficult. And of course, modern science boosted the life expectancy, improved agriculture, so things did get better in many ways. But don't make the materialist mistake of saying just a longer lifespan therefore means your life is more meaningful. It may, not necessarily though. You can live longer and still be unhappy, and still at the end of your life think, what was I doing? Maybe I made some big mistakes. Maybe I never had much meaning here in this place. So perhaps there's some sense in saying that people were more communal, communities were real. By necessity, you had to rely on the people that were physically near you. Whereas today, we don't rely on people that are physically near us to survive. We rely on the grocery store, we rely on the police for our security. So for our food, for our security, we're relying on people we don't know. I mean, they're technically part of our country, but even if they're part of our ethnic group, we don't know them at all. So, and we also don't live our lives according to the sun as much because we have modern electricity. So when the sun goes down, it doesn't force us to, retire to the house. We can still be out and about with our automobiles, which is, so we're isolated in our dwellings now, in our modern houses, whether that's in a modern apartment tower, a modern house, or a condo tower. We're still isolated in our cells, whereas there would have been more communal living by necessity, and because people had to rely on each other for survival more. I mean, the towns would have to defend themselves from bandits or who knows what. I mean, and then you'd probably be working in agriculture, and in many ways it would be a very hard life. But you had that connection to blood and soil. You had the connection to your kinsmen. The people around you were probably related to you, or more of them were related to you, or your family knew that family. And you had that real physical connection to the earth. I mean, personally, I like living in a house I would never want to live in an apartment tower, because once you get beyond the third or the fourth level, it becomes unsettling. I mean, looking out the window, I mean, it's a nice view, but then if there's ever a fire, are you going to want to jump from there? Do you have some fire escape? Hopefully you do, but that becomes more difficult if you're high up. But even if you could safely escape, it's not a comfortable feeling being so removed from the ground. I can't exactly describe it, but there's a feeling of being close to the soil, which is no pun intended, but it's grounding. It's relaxing. It's a chill neighborhood. It's a cool neighborhood to be in, where there's trees, there's houses, and you're on the second floor. It's nice being on the second floor, because then you're removed a bit, but you're not just down at street level. You have a bit of perspective over the neighborhood. That's the most chill way to live, in my opinion. Unless you live way out in the countryside, and then you can just live in a first floor house because there's no other houses around you. Then it doesn't make a difference. That's pretty chill too. Enclosure, I was bringing that up because that's when the idea that everything's going to be functionalized, everything's going to be parceled off. We're going to put a price tag on it, and that led to this. I mean, I'm cutting corners here, but basically, fast forward a few centuries, and you get like full-on modern capitalism. And I'm not necessarily criticizing everything about capitalism. I am a capitalist myself, but capitalism itself cannot be your rooting. It cannot be your foundational. You need a moral anchoring system to base your world on, and then you can have capitalism, and it's a very great system, and it allows for lots of growth. But then these lords, this merchant class, they didn't seem to care much about all these other people, and that didn't seem to produce the best situation for. But at least maybe in Europe, they've been able to maintain their urban growth more than in North America, even though we have more nature in North America, but they have more of a balance in Europe between the man-made world and the natural world. I mean, England being a very good example, like I already mentioned, because in North America, it's more like, okay, you have the man-made world, and then you have the wilderness. You don't have really much of a blending in between. I mean, of course, people would disagree with me. That's just my take on it, very loosely, very generally. I mean, there'd be probably lots of exceptions to that. It's just an ideal we would strive to. And I mean, the reason people were lost their land during enclosure was, well, because basically land started being enclosed, fenced off, where there had never been fences before, and then it became more important to pay your rents. And just a lot of people can't keep up with that, because a lot of people are never going to be able to compete in a modern capitalist society. That's just how it's going to be, because people are not equal. There's different levels of intelligence. There's different physical capabilities. They come from different backgrounds, different cultures. So that's why not everyone is going to be able to live the quote-unquote dream of having your own house and all those material rewards. And that's not to say that the material, the dream proved to be how many people imagined it to be. But so, I'm talking about the suburbs mainly, but you could just as easily talk about the apartment towers that I've loosely mentioned, briefly mentioned, where a lot of the lower income groups have been housed. And this phenomenon of the apartment towers, the projects, got going in the 20th century about the same time as the suburbs, especially after the war. So it's a simultaneous development. And that's part of design in many ways. I don't want to say it was a big conspiracy, but there were definitely government and corporate interests to destroy a community, maybe not ostensibly, or even perhaps they really, if they really wanted to destroy communities, it's possible, but don't underestimate the heartlessness of those in the upper echelons of power in our society. They would have no problem, just like the globalists have no problem today. mass immigration, like importing one group into another, into a neighborhood which is more established, and they bring in these people and they house them in projects. Maybe the people are there for economic reasons. Maybe the people, don't even end up getting jobs, and it turns into a ghetto. And so what happens is the former neighborhood is destroyed. You have the white flight to the suburbs. You had places like Atlanta, Detroit completely changing. Los Angeles today completely changing its ethnic character. So geographically, people move away. And sometimes there's even riots. There's urban degeneration. It doesn't always play out like that. Sometimes another group just replaces the other one. Like in Vancouver, it's mostly Chinese now, and they own much of the real estate. But there's this sort of, this creative destruction of capitalism, and that involves free movement. And not all. And Adam Smith, writing in the 18th century, probably would not have been too thrilled with a lot of all this stuff. I mean, I've read his Wealth of Nations, and he did realize that countries they had certain obligations to their peoples. But what's happened in the 20th century is that bond between ruler and people was forever severed. I mean, I was talking about enclosure in England, but I mean, if you think about the foundation of America, that process was already in full swing as soon as the founding of America in the 17th century got going. I mean, yeah, let's start enclosing the land right away. So right from the beginning, land was already being parceled off into plantations, and hence there was a constant push for people on the lower end of the social economic spectrum to keep moving west to get their chance at lording, I don't want to say lording it over others, but being your own lord, kind of. Having land was the most attractive means of getting settlers to Upper Canada, which became Ontario. Many of them were Americans after the 1790s. Most of them were Americans. And they had to swear an oath of allegiance to King George. No big deal, because you would get guaranteed some number of acres of land. I forget exactly how many, 5, 10 acres. I don't really remember, but that's a big deal. And then you'd be farming that, and then that would be your future. You could raise a family there. But at least that was still in an agricultural predominantly society, so people still had that rooting to the land. There wasn't really a need for parks and all of this sort of thing, but there was this chaos in the early American landscape, which you can arguably say has continued into the present day. This chaos of total freedom. I mean, freedom, it's a very popular word that still gets used today, and America being like the ultimate good is to preserve our freedom. It's all about, freedom from the British and freedom to pursue life, liberty, and happiness, or that kind of idea. But how about order? How about God? How about fitting into the world? How about hierarchy? How about playing your part in a greater project? And maybe you don't need all your freedom, actually. Oh, dare I say that? Oh dear me. In our globalist age, when they're taking away our freedoms, and I'm telling you that maybe you don't deserve all your freedoms. How dare I? But I'm just trying to strike a balance here, because you and I both know that most people aren't that smart, and many of us are very naughty people. It's a fallen world. That's the whole idea. It's a fallen world. It's a fallen world. Man seeks material things. Man seeks comfort in material riches. He wants to rule land. Who wants to rule land? Who wants to rule over principalities? What spirits are attached to land? What spirits are attached to land? I'll just leave that open-ended, but we don't need to get off onto that. So you have the American Revolution, which most people probably didn't care one way or the other about, but it was, put forward by the merchant classes because they had a lot to gain from it. And the British were doing some things wrong that did warrant some discontent, of course. But the Americans rebelled against their king, So you did have that system of order, and I'm speaking as a Canadian. I can appreciate this from my perspective. I'm not talking down to the Americans. Canada's gone crazy. It's gone more liberal than any other liberal country. But we did have a more conservative foundation than the foundation of the U.S. because we were loyal to King George. I'm not talking about Quebec and all that, but it was founded originally on being loyal to the king. So at least we had that for a time. We've lost all of that. But that was a good thing. And the principle of that was a good thing, that there's order in the world. It wasn't order to the extent of the Roman Catholic Church. The Protestant world was more chaotic. And to an extent, England, the king was always less powerful than on the continent. There were geographic reasons for that as well. But basically, there was this, so the liberal experiment in America, it was based on constant need to expand and gobble up land, and then they ran out of land. And they were, I'm not busting their balls for replacing the Native Americans. They were more successful, and they replaced Native American civilization with arguably, obviously a more technologically advanced civilization, still a Christian civilization, and I think that was a good thing. I'm not dissing the American Native Americans. They had some virtues, but it was, in many ways, they were different cultures, but it was a savage civilization. But on the other hand, there was this constant chaos to, and not just a capitalist chaos of expansion, but also like the religious chaos of all these different religious groups, because the Protestant Reformation was so chaotic and splintering from the beginning. Like all these disagreements. Can you imagine what it must have been like along the 17th century U.S. seaboard, where it's like this town is. It's like there would be, just these different clans and then there'd be crazy witch trials and just like this collective mania, all this. And by the way, I believe in witchcraft, but you can see how the sort of chaos of that world would lead to these, crazes. And it didn't help that there were Indians trying to kill them, and the problem is they didn't trust the landowners, they didn't trust the plantation owners, and then the common man is getting pushed back inland. He's trying to eke out a living, and then you get all the importation of African slaves, and then the African slaves, their population rises, then they're valued by their slave owners, by the plantation owners, and then the people inland are like, we don't even want slavery because that's just bad for us, because then the value of land is gonna increase. Like, enough with the slavery, you gotta limit this stuff. Like, it's not even good for the common man. It's just stupid plantation owners that just want to make more money and gobble up more land. So this is, I'm trying to paint a picture of where we got to where we are. But so you had that chaos of America and wanting to, everything has to be parceled out. Freedom is the ultimate good. Order comes second. Fitting into a natural hierarchy comes second. And we don't need no monarchy. They didn't elect. Maybe George Washington. Fine. You overthrew King George. At least you could choose your own king. George Washington could be the king. But they're like, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do a republic. And it was based on a firm foundation in the sense that only powerful men would be able to vote. But hey, you're still splitting power, and that's still unstable foundation, because sooner or later people are going to say, well, if these guys can vote, then maybe you could just let a few more people vote, and then that just snowballs, and then eventually everyone's going to want to vote, and we're going to have 3-year-olds voting, we're going to have babies voting next, and then, but the United States will dissolve into separate states before that happens. It's interesting that people can just chill in a busy area, on a busy street, and I think there's like this numbness. You need this like sort of healthy, I don't know if it's healthy or not, this sort of healthy numbness to the urban area. And a lot of that goes with exposure to noise, to the sounds of traffic, to the sounds of airplanes in the sky. If you go to High Park, which is Toronto's equivalent of Central Park, not as big as Central Park in New York, but it's a fairly big park, surrounded by a dense city. And it's in many ways a very wonderful park with many trails, ravines, and they have a zoo there. They have many, basically trees, old trees, nice trees. But the thing is, The south end of, I mean, you can avoid the noise of the city kind of if you're at the north end of Hyde Park because you're higher in elevation. But I mean, once you get to the south end, you hear the railway tracks. You hear Lakeshore Boulevard, which is a very wide street with constant traffic. You hear the Gardner Expressway, which is a highway, and then you're just exposed to all of that, and it takes away the feeling of being in nature. It takes away that feeling. So it's a shame in many ways. I don't think it's like, oh, they're trying to scramble your brain waves and you know, they're trying to mind control you. I don't know about that, but I just think it's a psychological disturbance. I mean, you have to like numb yourself, and you just do it self-consciously. You just desensitize yourself to living in a neighborhood like this. It's getting back to what I was saying about just being comfortable hanging out in urban areas. It's not easy to find that sort of place unless you are a person that is either a social butterfly that likes people watching when there's people everywhere, or you are just in some senses numb to the feeling, or you're just so focused on something else that just nothing else can bother you. And that's a tall order, I think. One of the great things about, you know, having a nice bike is you can get into these ravines and you can kind of escape the city. The other night I was with my friends near James Gardens, which is on the border with Etobicoke and York. And there, I mean, you'll even see deer at night. It's wide enough that, you know, most people won't go down there at night. Well, there'll be some people going down there at night, but there's just forest land, floodplain. You will see deer, you will see rabbits, skunks. You don't really see coyotes in the city anymore because they've all been culled because they would be eating people's small dogs. But you know, that's cool. So you can see that stuff. And the best thing about hanging out there at night was the silence. There was no roar of traffic. I mean, sure, you're going to hear it a little bit. But being down in that valley there, and it's not in the flight path either. You go further north, you go a few kilometers further north, oh, you're in the flight path. Big jets coming pretty close to you. And those jets are passing over immigrant areas where the immigrants, many South Asians, they've all moved into the suburbs now. And they live in North Etobicoke. They live in Rexdale. A lot of black people live in North Etobicoke too. And the flights go over their houses. So there's this natural sorting of the world. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I think this is all terrible. I don't want anyone to experience this. I think it is a psychological form of not warfare, but just no, like, well, I was going to say obviously it's noise, but it's just this background chatter, which is designed to disconnect you from grounding, disconnect you from rooting, not necessarily by intention, but by default or byproduct of our own materialistic society. No natural order, no nice English countryside for us, no nice balance where, okay, we've shaped the land, we've cut down lots of the trees, but we still have space, we still have peace. Like, no, we don't have that. You want peace, you have to go, you have to make somewhat extraordinary measures. I mean, you can have a car, you can escape the city, but then you're still isolated in your little box there, and you're still going to get caught in traffic. So yeah, obviously own a car, learn to drive. I'm a silly millennial who doesn't drive, but you can just do that and escape. But the whole point of this is rooting, right? That's what I was trying to get at. So yeah, of course you take your car, you escape into nature, but then you're in wilderness. How about just having enough of the two mixed is what I'm trying to say. We don't have that natural balance, so we're forced where you have to flee the city. I always have my car, I can always flee the city. That's great. Well, how about, wouldn't it be nice not living in the city? I don't want to live in the city. That's the whole point. We've been so steeped in this way of living now that we can't imagine any other alternative. And it's not particularly a nice world. I mean, it's ugly. I've already described. It's plain. It's not exceedingly ugly. It's not dilapidated, but it's empty. It's spiritually empty. Everything's sectioned off, demarcated. Everything becomes about functionalism. No natural space for play, for freedom, for mystery, for the beauty to emerge. So I didn't say much about condos, but condos are like insect boxes. I think of them. Little cricket people and bug people, beetle people, ant people, mantis people. The mantis people are the real estate agents They are like female praying mantises. Those are the real estate agents. And then the bug people are the ones who, the grubs and all those, the grubs are the little kids who grow up in condos. Not a good place to grow up. And then just all those variety of insects, but it's not like a natural hive that the insects built themselves. It's more like a metal box with shelves. Not exactly like a professional beekeeping, but different, more like a science experiment. And then they have their little trays that they're fit in. And trays are like move the tray in and out, and you'll smell other people's smells. You'll smell other people smoking. I mean, now we have legal marijuana, which has its disadvantages, which has some advantages. But you're going to smell the weed coming up from the floor below you. I know my friend, he lives in a condo. He moved in recently, and he told me, it's like, yeah, the people downstairs, they're smoking, so they have to close their windows now. So it's like, well, that's condo living. An older condo, one that was built more than 10 years ago. So at least it's of the older generation, which was actually better, I was going to say. The new generation with this whole bubble, now everything's so cheap that they'll force the buildings up and then the windows will fall off later, and that glass will be plummeting to earth. It will shatter on the ground, and just better hope you weren't anywhere near that. These huge rickety structures, they look like big USB plastic composites of emptiness. It's so horrible to see these condos. A condo development in your neighborhood is a bad sign. I mean, you may disagree. It depends on the local situation, but it's now reached that point where it's like, they're building a condo down the street. Oh no, oh geez. I'm not necessarily opposed to gentrification. There's good things about gentrification for sure, but once it reaches a certain point, I don't want to live in a neighborhood where it's all condo dwellers. And that's what they do. They become their own types of ghettos. They will be ghettos. Many parts of the city will be ghettos. They'll be condo ghettos. Hasta luego, amigos.